The year was 1888. The month was November, and the cold had teeth. Audra stood on the porch, the splintered wood a lattice of frost beneath the thin soles of her boots. She held a flour sack containing 2 books and a heel of bread. Her German shepherd, Cassian, pressed against her leg, a low growl vibrating in his chest. The wind coming down from the peaks did not care that she was 18. It did not care that she had nowhere to go. It was simply wind doing what wind does. Her uncle, Sterling, held the door open just enough to frame his face, a face worn down by disappointment. He looked not at her, but at the dog. He eats more than his worth, and you read more than is proper. I have no more room for things that do not earn their keep. He tossed a single, worn silver dollar into the dust at her feet. It made a dull, final sound. The door closed. The bolt slid home. The sound was louder than the wind. Audra looked down at the coin, then up at the grey, unforgiving sky. Behind the altar of the forgotten church on the edge of town, a floorboard was loose. She did not know why that detail came to her then, only that it did. Tell us, where are you watching from today, and what forgotten places exist in your part of the world? Audra had arrived in her uncle's house at the age of 10, a quiet, observant child carrying her father's surveying tools and her mother's books on botany. Sterling and his wife, Martha, took her in as an obligation, a Christian duty to be performed with size and thin soup. They were plain people who saw the world as a set of simple instructions to be followed. Work, pray, sleep, repeat. Audra, however, saw the world as a set of questions to be answered. While other girls learned stitchery, Audra learned the language of rock formations from a tattered geology pamphlet. She drew maps of the creek beds and annotated them with the types of watercress that grew in the shade. When she was supposed to be churning butter, her uncle would find her reading an almanac, her finger tracing the lines of lunar cycles, her lips moving silently. She wasn't defiant. She was simply elsewhere. Her mind was a territory her aunt and uncle could not enter, and they resented her for it. The community of Prospect Ridge was small, a place where conformity was a type of currency. Difference was a debt. Audra's quiet intensity, her preference for books and the company of her dog over church socials, made people uneasy. They did not have a word for what she was, so they chose the words they knew. Odd. Aloof. Unnatural. The preacher, a man named Reverend Miller, once stopped her on the street. He looked at the book in her hands, a guide to medicinal herbs, and his lips thinned. There is knowledge that edifies the soul, child, he'd said, his voice a low warning. And there is knowledge that invites speculation. A woman's mind is not built for the weight of it. It was not meant as a personal cruelty. It was, to him, a statement of fact, as plain as the mountains that ringed their valley. He was trying to save her from a world that had no category for a mind like hers. The rejection was not a single event, but a slow, steady erosion. It was in the way Martha would snatch a book from her hands, muttering about idle hands and the devil's workshop. It was in the way the other children would fall silent when she and Cassian walked past. It was in the exhausted sigh Sterling gave every time he saw her staring at the mountains, as if she were plotting an escape he could not comprehend. Her presence was a constant, low-grade irritation, a reminder of a world outside their understanding. They did not hate her. They simply did not know what to do with her. And in a place like Prospect Ridge, what could not be used was eventually discarded. The final argument had been about a goat. One of the nanny goats had taken sick, and while Sterling prepared to put it out of its misery, Audra had intervened. She'd spent 2 days applying poultices made from willow bark and yarrow, things she'd read about. She sat with the animal, coaxing it to drink water, Cassian standing guard at the barn door. On the 3rd day, the goat was standing, nibbling at hay. Sterling had looked at the recovered animal not with gratitude, but with a deep and unsettling suspicion. He saw not a cure, but a kind of witchcraft. It was the last piece of evidence he needed. She was not like them. She would never be like them. The world of practical magic she inhabited was a threat to his world of simple rules. And so, with the first hard frost of November, he had cast her out. The silver dollar was not payment. It was a severance. The first night was the coldest. The wind found every crack in the walls of the abandoned church. It was a small, clapboard structure at the far edge of town, slumped like an old man with a bad back. The county clerk, a man with ink-stained fingers and little patience, had laughed when she'd pushed the silver dollar across his desk for the deed. The land was worthless, a scree slope of granite and sand that grew nothing but scrub pine. The church itself was considered a public nuisance. For $1, the town was happy to be rid of it. Audra and Cassian huddled together behind the dilapidated altar, wrapped in a threadbare horse blanket she'd found in the vestry. The cold was not a feeling. It was a presence. It settled deep in her bones, a heavy, aching weight. Her teeth chattered until her jaw hurt, then they stopped. She knew from her books that this was a bad sign. Shivering was the body's way of fighting. When the shivering stopped, the fight was ending. She thought about going back. She imagined knocking on her uncle's door, the shame a hot stone in her throat. She could apologize. She could promise to be different. She could burn her books, sell the dog, and become the person they wanted her to be. She pictured the warm kitchen, the smell of Martha's watery stew, the simple, thoughtless heat of the wood stove. The thought was so tempting it made her dizzy. She lay in the dark, the wind whistling a desolate song through the broken stained glass window, and considered that this might be where her story ended. On the floor of a forgotten church, frozen into silence. Cassian whined, a low, anxious sound. He nudged her hand with his cold nose, then licked her face. The dog's simple, biological insistence pulled her back. He was hungry. He was cold. He was depending on her. A body makes decisions before the mind catches up. Her hand went to his thick ruff, her fingers curling into his fur. A practical problem demanded attention. They needed fire. The next days were a blur of methodical, desperate work. The body fails in specific ways. Her fingers, raw from prying up loose floorboards for firewood, went from burning to numb. She stopped being able to feel the tips. The hunger was a constant, dull ache that sharpened into a piercing cramp whenever she moved too fast. Dizziness would wash over her, forcing her to her knees. She survived on melted snow and the last of her bread, which she shared with Cassian, his portion always slightly larger than hers. The silence was the worst part. It was a physical pressure, broken only by the wind and the sound of her own breathing. She worked. It was all she knew how to do. She used a shard of thick, blue glass from the broken window as a knife, cutting strips from the horse blanket to plug the worst of the cracks in the walls. She used the heavy, leather-bound pulpit Bible as a hammer, breaking apart a rotted pew for kindling. Each small success was a victory measured in a few more hours of life. A fire that caught on the first try. A patch that kept the wind out. A bucket of clean snow. These were not triumphs. They were transactions. An hour of work for an hour of warmth. It was on the fourth day, while sweeping the debris from behind the altar, that her foot snagged on a floorboard. It was the one she had noticed before, the one that sat just slightly higher than the others. Curiosity was a luxury she couldn't afford, but this was different. It was an anomaly, a question in a room full of grim answers. She knelt, her knees protesting on the cold wood. Using the edge of the glass shard, she worked at the seam. The wood was swollen and stubborn. It took an hour. Her fingers were clumsy, unresponsive things, but she persisted. Finally, with a groan of old nails, the board came loose. Beneath it was not dirt. It was a small, dark space, and a cast iron ring bolted to a square section of the subfloor. A trap door. Her heart, which had been beating a slow, sluggish rhythm, gave a painful thump. She pulled. It was heavy. Cassian stood over the opening, his ears perked, a low growl starting in his throat. She pulled again, putting her entire weight into it. The door lifted with a shriek of rusted hinges, revealing a set of steep, stone steps leading down into absolute darkness. The air that rose up smelled of damp earth, of stone, and of something else. Time. It smelled of time. She lit a splinter of wood from her small fire. The flame flickered, casting dancing shadows down the narrow passage. It wasn't a tunnel. It was a cellar, dug out of the rock beneath the church. Stone walls, a low, arched ceiling. And in the center of the small room, a single object. A heavy, sea-worn chest, bound in iron straps. She descended the steps, Cassian close behind her, his nails clicking on the stone. The air was still and cold, but it was a different cold. A deep, subterranean cold, free of the wind. She knelt before the chest. The lock was rusted shut. She spent the rest of the day working on it, using a nail pried from a pew and the heavy spine of the Bible. The sun was setting, casting long, purple shadows through the church, when the lock finally gave way with a sharp crack. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, resting on a bed of what looked like dried leaves, were not coins or jewels. There was a leather-bound journal, a set of rolled parchments tied with a leather thong, a compass, and a small, canvas bag that clinked when she touched it. She opened the bag. It was full of seeds. Dozens of small, paper packets, each labeled in a careful, spidery script. Winter cabbage. Mountain spinach. A strain of tomato called Glacier. She unrolled the parchments. It was a map. Not of a county or a state, but of the mountains that loomed over the town. It was covered in drawings, calculations, and notes about geology, water tables, and solar exposure. At the top, in the same careful script, was a title, The Solace Garden. An arrow pointed to a specific, unnamed peak, and next to it, a single sentence. Where the mountain breathes warm, life does not bow to winter. She did not feel relief. She did not feel joy. She sat on the cold stone floor of the cellar, the map spread before her, and felt something she had no word for. It felt like recognition. It was as if the person who had built this church, who had drawn this map, had been waiting. Waiting for someone who could read it. The map was not a simple document. It was a puzzle written in the language of the earth, and Audra was one of the few people left who could speak it. The man who drew it, a reclusive minister and prospector named Alastair Finch, had filled his journal with observations. He wrote of schist and granite, of fault lines and watercourses. He noted the way certain mosses only grew on north-facing rocks and how the angle of the sun in the winter solstice struck a particular notch in the high ridge. It was a conversation across time, between two minds that saw the world in the same way. For weeks, the church became her base of operations. Survival was still a daily struggle, but now it had a purpose. She and Cassian established a routine. Mornings were for survival, trapping small game with snares made from salvaged organ wire, gathering firewood, reinforcing the church against the deepening winter. Afternoons were for the map. She would sit by her small fire, the journal in her lap, cross-referencing its notes with the drawings on the parchment. She was no longer just enduring. She was deciphering. The first attempts to follow the map were failures. The mountains were a vast, indifferent wilderness. She made short, exploratory trips, never going so far that she couldn't see the broken steeple of the church. She used a piece of salvaged tin, polished with sand, as a signal mirror. Each trip taught her something. She learned the deceptive distances, the suddenness of the weather, the feel of solid rock versus treacherous shale underfoot. Cassian was her guide. His senses were sharper than hers. He could smell water, detect the presence of animals, and sense unstable ground before she could see it. He was not a pet. He was a partner. Her tools were improvised. She lashed her glass shard to a sturdy branch to make a small hand axe. She wove a sledge from pine boughs to haul firewood more efficiently. The hollowed-out pipes of the old church organ became conduits to channel snowmelt into a barrel. She was not just surviving on the land, she was entering into a dialogue with it, using what it provided to solve the problems it presented. The breakthrough came from a passage in the journal describing a specific type of limestone, one that was porous and streaked with a faint, reddish mineral. Finch wrote that this rock formation was always found near geological vents, places where the Earth's inner warmth seeped close to the surface. He called it breathing rock. According to the map, a large deposit of it formed a cliff face 2 days' walk up the western slope of the unnamed peak. The journey was the most difficult thing she had ever done. She packed dried rabbit meat, her blanket, and the tools. The snow was deep, and the climb was steep. The cold was relentless. On the second day, a blizzard swept in, reducing visibility to a few feet. She and Cassian took shelter in a shallow overhang, the wind howling around them. The temptation to turn back was immense. But the map, folded inside her coat, felt like a promise. When the storm broke, the world was white and silent. She was disoriented. She was about to give up when Cassian began to dig frantically at the base of a snow-covered cliff. He whined, looking back at her, then dug again. She pushed the snow away. Beneath it was the rock from the journal. Limestone, porous and streaked with the telltale red. She followed the cliff face, her gloved hand tracing the stone. It was cold, but not as cold as the granite around it. It was subtly, almost imperceptibly, less frozen. She followed the formation for a quarter of a mile until it ended in a narrow fissure, almost completely hidden by a cluster of snow-laden pines. A faint, almost invisible plume of vapor rose from the opening. It looked like a breath held in the cold air. She pushed through the branches. The opening was just wide enough for her to squeeze through. Cassian followed at her heels. The inside was not a cave. It was a cathedral. A vast limestone cavern opened before them, its ceiling lost in the darkness above. And it was warm. A gentle, humid warmth rose from the ground, carrying the scent of wet earth and minerals. A spring bubbled from a fissure in the rock, its water steaming in the cool air. The water flowed across the cavern floor, creating a terrace series of shallow pools before disappearing back into the rock. The air was thick with moisture. The ground was not rock, but deep, rich soil, washed into the cavern over centuries. And in the faint light filtering from unseen vents high above, something was growing. A carpet of pale, green moss and strange, shade-loving ferns covered the ground. She dropped to her knees. She plunged her bare hands into the soil. It was warm to the touch. This was the solace garden. It was not a treasure of gold. It was a treasure of life. A place where winter had no power. Her first proof was a handful of radishes. She had planted a few of the seeds from the chest in a small, tilled patch near the spring. 3 weeks later, she pulled one from the warm earth. It was pale and small, but it was perfect. She wiped the dirt off on her trousers and took a bite. The sharp, peppery snap filled her mouth. It tasted of the earth. It tasted of defiance. It was the first fresh food she had eaten in months. She sat on the cavern floor, Cassian's head in her lap, and ate the entire radish, leaf and root. It was a sacrament. An ally arrived not as a rescuer, but as a customer. She had managed to grow a small surplus of winter lettuce and radishes. She needed supplies the mountain couldn't provide: salt, flour, lamp oil. She walked into Prospect Ridge General Store, a crate of perfect, pale green lettuce heads in her arms. The storekeeper, a man named Mr. Abernathy, looked at the greens as if they were ghosts. It was January. Nothing green had been seen in the valley for 2 months. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. He was an old man, stooped and quiet, a rock hound who the townspeople tolerated because his assays were honest. He was, like her, a person the community overlooked. "I have a winter garden," Audra said simply. He picked up a head of lettuce, his thumb stroking a leaf. He had seen her come into town before, a thin girl with a big dog, buying small amounts of flour. He knew she lived in the old church. He had assumed she was barely surviving. He looked from the impossible lettuce to her face, and he saw not a destitute orphan, but a person of quiet, inexplicable competence. He saw something of himself. He did not ask more questions. He traded her a generous amount of flour, salt, and 2 full tins of oil for the crate. "You bring more of this," he said, his eyes meeting hers, "and I will have more to trade." The community's conversion was slow. It began at Mr. Abernathy's store. People saw the greens. They whispered. They scoffed. The Reverend Miller warned from his pulpit about things that grow against God's seasons, hinting at unnatural forces. But hunger is a more powerful sermon than fear. A family with a sick child bought a bunch of her spinach. The child's fever broke. A miner, tired of salt pork and dried beans, bought a bag of her crisp radishes and declared them a miracle. They came not for her, but for what she produced. They would leave their money or trade goods on the steps of the church, and she would leave the produce. They did not need to understand it. They only needed to eat. She was no longer the town's oddity. She was the woman in the church on the hill, the one who grew lettuce in the snow. And in the harsh calculus of the frontier, that was a kind of power. The winter that followed was the worst in living memory. The snow started in October and did not stop. Blizzards buried houses to their eaves. The pass was closed. Supply wagons could not get through. The town's meager stores began to dwindle. Sickness followed hunger. A hacking cough settled over the valley, a dry, persistent sound that echoed in the church, in the general store, in every home. People grew thin, their faces pale and drawn. The cold was no longer just an inconvenience, it was a siege. Audra and Cassian were untouched. Inside the solace garden, it was perpetually spring. The geothermal warmth kept the cavern at a steady 50 degrees. Her crops flourished. Rows of cabbages, spinach, kale, and even the Sglacio tomatoes, which ripened to a pale orange in the dim light, grew in abundance. She had learned the cavern's rhythms, its pockets of warmth and humidity. She had even managed to rig a shelter for a few goats she'd traded for, their milk providing cheese she aged in a smaller, cooler side cave. She was not just surviving. She was thriving. The mountain had given her what the town never could, a place where her unique knowledge was the key to abundance. One evening, there was a knock on the church door. It was a hesitant, uncertain sound, almost lost in the wind. Cassian stood, a low growl in his chest. Audra quieted him with a hand on his back. She opened the door. It was her uncle. Sterling stood on the step, a man diminished. He was smaller than she remembered. The rigid certainty in his posture was gone, replaced by a weary slump. The cold had scoured the hardness from his face, leaving behind something soft and afraid. He was not holding a rifle or a Bible. He was holding an empty burlap sack. He did not look at her, but at the ground, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Martha is sick," he said. His voice was rough, unused. "The boy from next door, he passed this morning." The cough. "There is no fresh food." Nothing. He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with a desperation she had never seen there before. "They say you have food. Things that grow." Audra looked at the man who had thrown her out into the cold with $1. She felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not pity. He was simply a practical problem that had appeared at her door. The past was irrelevant. The present was a man with an empty sack and a sick wife. Her response was not emotional. It was logistical. "How many people in your house?" she asked. He blinked, surprised by the question. Just the two of us now." "Wait here." She turned and went back inside, leaving him on the doorstep. She returned a few minutes later with 2 heavy sacks. One was filled with cabbages, potatoes she had grown, and bunches of dark green kale. The other contained 2 wheels of goat cheese and a half-dozen jars of canned tomatoes. She pushed them into his hands. The weight of them seemed to surprise him. He looked down at the food, then back at her. He seemed to be searching for words, but none came. He fumbled inside his coat and pulled out a small, dog-eared photograph. It was of her parents, the only one she'd had, which he had kept when she was cast out. He held it out to her. It was not an apology. It was a transaction. A return of something stolen. An acknowledgement of a debt. She took the photograph. "The kale is best boiled with a little salt," she said. "It will help with the cough." He nodded, unable to speak. He turned and walked away, a stooped figure leaning into the wind, carrying the impossible harvest back into the dying town. She watched him go, then closed the door. The work was waiting. That winter, Audra fed Prospect Ridge. She organized a system. People left requests and whatever they could trade in a box on the church steps. Every morning, she and Cassian would make the journey to the cavern and return with sledges laden with food. She never saw the townspeople. She never asked for thanks. She simply met the need. She did not do it out of forgiveness. Forgiveness was a word from a world of sermons and Sunday socials. She did it because it was the work that was in front of her. You do not ask a starving person if they are sorry. You give them food. Time passed. The town recovered. The story of the girl in the church became a local legend. Some still whispered of witchcraft, but most spoke of something else. They spoke of resilience. They spoke of a quiet competence that had saved them when their own systems had failed. Young people, those who, like her, did not quite fit, began to appear at her door. They did not come for sermons. They came to learn. She taught them how to read the land, how to cultivate the warm earth of the cavern, how to save seeds, how to build what they needed from what they had. She gave away the knowledge as freely as she had given the food. The Solace Garden became a school. Audra never married. Her partnership was with the land, and her family was the succession of young, capable people she trained. She died in her 79th year, sitting in a chair on the porch of the small, sturdy house she had built next to the church. A cup of mint tea, grown in her garden, was still warm on the table beside her. A packet of saved seeds for a new variety of high-altitude corn rested in her lap. From the cavern on the mountain, she could hear the faint sounds of her students, laughing as they worked. She looked like a person who had just finished a long and satisfying book. Her legacy was not in gold, but in calories and knowledge. Over 5 decades, the garden she started fed thousands. She trained more than 100 students who took her methods to other harsh climates, creating their own pockets of impossible life. They put a simple stone marker for her in the churchyard. It did not mention God or salvation. It said only, Audra Finch. She built a garden. Perhaps you have a sealed door in your own life. A place you were cast out from, a gift you possess that the world told you was worthless. Maybe there is a cave you have been standing outside of, a place where your own unique knowledge is the key. You might feel the cold wind and believe the story is over. But the earth is full of hidden warmth. The question is not whether you will be rejected. The question is what you will build when you are. The chest Audra found behind the altar held a map, but the true treasure was the knowledge required to read it. Some things are not given. They are deciphered. If these stories of quiet resilience are what you seek, consider subscribing to our channel. Our next history is about a lighthouse keeper who saved a town using nothing but a book on birds and a broken mirror.